There is some speculation among scholars that early counterpoint treatises like the Musica Incuriatus were documenting an established improvisatory practice rather than advocating a new method of composition. Improvised counterpoint has been documented in a number of different cultures, including our own popular culture. When I was young, I occasionally performed with ad hoc groups who played a kind of music that was then known as folk rock. Some of these musicians could read music, some could not. But regardless, the kind of music that we performed was improvised. By improvised, I don't mean that the music was actually made up on the spot during performance. What I mean is that the music was improvised by the individuals in the group during rehearsals. When backup singers were present, they were often asked to find the harmony. This procedure involved the leader, the singer-songwriter, singing the melody and playing chords on the guitar or piano. The backup singers would pick out notes from the harmony by ear, and they would try to connect them with smooth voice leading in order to create a nice contrapuntal line. Some singers would try to find a high part, others would search out a lower part. They would usually end up tracking each other in thirds and sixths. This finding the harmony routine produced results that were very much like medieval organum, except with thirds and sixths, where organum would have used fourths and fifths. Organum was based on the idea that music should be harmonious, meaning consonant. Practitioners of organum would take a melody and double it with harmonious intervals, fourths, fifths, and octaves. Occasionally, other intervals would be used. These would be dissonant intervals, and they would only be used in special places between the consonances. Here's an example from the Musica Incuriatus. It should be noted that this example begins on a unison and moves outward to parallel fourths through the interval of a second and a third. It should also be noted that the cadences are accomplished through parallel unisons. The striking thing for modern musicians is that thirds and sixths were not considered consonances. Today, when we are finding the harmony, we seek out thirds and sixths. In the Middle Ages, they would seek out octaves, fourths and fifths, and avoid thirds and sixths. Modern teaching of counterpoint does acknowledge this, with our classification of consonances into perfect and imperfect, with thirds and sixths falling into the imperfect category. I often think that our teaching of counterpoint is too complicated. We give the students a long list of what not to do, instead of telling them what to do. Simply use thirds and sixths most of the time. In the Middle Ages, I would have told my students to use other intervals almost all the time, namely octaves, fourths, and fifths. This would be ill-advised today because it would lead to the most heinous of all contrapuntal crimes, the production of parallel octaves and fifths. The prohibition against parallel fifths and octaves is a curious phenomenon. It's surprising because it prohibits movement between the two most consonant intervals in a style where consonance is highly prized. It's also a surprisingly strong prohibition. It has the weight of a musical commandment. I remember the first graduate music theory class I taught. I asked the students, what was the most important thing that you learned in undergraduate music theory? To a person they answered, don't use parallel octaves and parallel fifths. Somehow I don't think this is the most important thing in all of music theory. I think we stress this idea too much. Parallel octaves and fifths were not prohibited in the Middle Ages, nor were they excluded in the 20th century. Still, there persists the idea that there was an absolute prohibition on parallel octaves and fifths from the Renaissance through the Romantic period. In truth, composers often ignored this prohibition. I was unaware of this fact when I was a student, but I became painfully aware of it well into my teaching career. When my university installed computers with internet connections in every classroom, I ceased being as well prepared for class. I knew that I didn't need to prepare musical examples as carefully, that in a pinch, I could download what I needed from the internet and project it on the big screen. I was in a particular rush when I was scheduled to analyze the Beethoven Bagatelle, Opus 119, number 1. I knew the piece pretty well, so preparation wasn't a problem. All I needed was a score. When I got to the classroom, I downloaded the first one I found on the internet. After having analyzed the piece, I told my students that this piece contained one of the few examples I knew where Beethoven made a mistake. He created parallel octaves. I found the passage in the score, but lo and behold, no parallel octaves. After class, I went back to my office to check my score, and the parallel octaves reappeared. It seemed that Beethoven had probably not written parallel octaves after all. There was probably just a printer's error in my score. That should have been the end of it. My score was wrong. Beethoven would have never written parallel octaves. But I couldn't let it go. The parallel sixths from the other edition just didn't sound right to me. After additional research, I found Alan Tyson's article, The First Edition of Beethoven's Opus 119 Bagatelles, in an old edition of the Musical Quarterly. It turns out the parallel octaves did appear in the first authorized version of the Bagatelle, which was published by Clementi in London in 1823. Beethoven wrote a letter to the publisher about the publication where he said, quote, "I am quite satisfied." I take this to mean that Beethoven approved of the parallel octaves. Since they're also there in Beethoven's autograph of the work, I felt that I had my answer. These octaves are not a mistake on the part of the printer, nor are they a mistake on Beethoven's part. They are there on purpose. It turns out the edition I had used in class was a pirated edition. I assumed the editor for that edition had fixed the parallel octaves, assuming as I did, that they were a mistake on Beethoven's part. So why would Beethoven actually want to use parallel octaves? Parallel octaves create the effect of contrapuntal voices collapsing into a single line, in this case, at a cadence. I believe that Beethoven intentionally used parallel octaves in order to strengthen the movement into the cadence. The composer of the organum that we saw in the Musica Incuriatus did exactly the same kind of thing. Here's a similar effect in a Haydn piano sonata. While there are 16th notes between the octaves are still there, pulling strongly into the cadence. Examples of intentional parallel fifths are harder to find. I'm particularly fond of these, found at the end of a piece by Stefan Heller. These examples show that prominent composers sometimes indulged in these prohibited intervals. Even so, I assumed that as a music theory teacher myself, all music theorists must have railed against them. This is not the case. Gottfried Weber, one of the most prominent of all 19th century music theorists, wrote, "On this point, there exists a great contrariety between the old musicians and the musical artists of the present day. The former avoided everything in the shape of parallelism by fifths with the most assiduous care, and shuddered and had the earache the moment they could anywhere discover even the remotest shadow of a parallel progression by fifths. The latter, on the contrary, lifting up their heads with a buoyant spirit of liberty and a dignified contempt of the antiquated pedantic prejudices, reject and condemn all of the old prohibitions of parallelisms by fifths as pedantic trash and useless scholastic lore." Historically, as parallel octaves and fifths became forbidden at the end of the Middle Ages, their use began to decline. By the 18th century, parallel fifths had almost died out altogether, while parallel octaves were primarily used for doubling. So much for the perfect intervals of the fifth and the octave. What about the perfect fourth? Most people would rate it as a perfect consonance, similar in sound to the perfect fifth. Yet in counterpoint and in common practice harmony, it's often considered a dissonance. This dissonant effect is sometimes described as an instability. It's unstable because it yearns to resolve to a third. While today, most of us can hear the fourth yearning to resolve to the third, Joseph Yasser believed that this was not always the case. Yasser believed that because medieval theorists classified fourths as consonances and thirds as dissonances, that medieval people actually heard them that way. In other words, medieval people would have heard a fourth moving to a third as a consonance that was going to a dissonance, rather than the resolution of the dissonance that we hear today. This whole phenomenon of consonance and dissonance is relative and somewhat arbitrary. According to Yasser, we can't even hear medieval music correctly without adjusting our hearing to a different system of consonance and dissonance. Yasser pointed out that this different way of hearing has historical documentation. To the ancient Greeks, a dissonance was any interval smaller than a perfect fourth. While some medieval theorists considered both fourths and fifths to be fundamental consonances, Yasser cites Guido of Arezzo as forbidding even the organum of the perfect fifth. So the fourth was considered a foundational interval, sometimes to the exclusion of the fifth, up until the period from about 1200 to 1400. At that time, fourths and fifths were phased out as foundational intervals, and thirds and sixths were phased in. Having said that, thirds and sixths were only gradually accepted. The theorist, Walter of Ottingen, called these intervals endurable by the ear. It's not exactly a ringing endorsement, but at least it's a step toward tertian harmony. The banishment of parallel octaves and fifths was soon to follow. So the takeaway from all of this is that consonance is fundamental to counterpoint. Consonant intervals create the structural framework for music. Dissonance may be admitted between these structural consonances, but must be resolved to one of these structural consonances. The problem with this concept of counterpoint is that which intervals are dissonant and which intervals are consonant varies from time period to time period, from style to style, from culture to culture. The counterpoint rules that we teach today are style specific, and this is ironic because the style that we teach is hundreds of years out of date. While exactly which intervals are consonant or dissonant has fluctuated over the years, the interplay of consonance and dissonance has always been important. If we return for a minute to species counterpoint, we should notice that it's primarily concerned with controlling dissonance. First species controls dissonance by not allowing it at all. The other species control dissonance by considering it to be outside the basic structure of the music, which is created by consonance. In species counterpoint, dissonance happens only between consonances or resolves into them. It's not part of the basic structure of music. If you really want to understand music, reverse engineer it. Strip away the dissonance. Take it back to first species counterpoint. That's a good way to reveal the music's fundamental structure.